Okay, sorry. I think what we've learned here is that our panelists have learned from each other. So let me ask one question.
A few minutes from you all the time.
Yeah, that's fine. So we'll let them ask each other questions in a minute. But I had a question for the panelists, which is, in this situation where we're in a dangerous period for ideological and political reasons, what is the decision-making process in Israel and in Iran that might lead to the most dire outcome? First, Avner, who will decide whether there's war in Israel?
I want to say two things. First, I think that the likelihood that Israel ever use nuclear weapons in anger without being attacked first is nil. I think that there is enormous sense of inhibition in Israel about that, and I think it would be a betray in a very profound sense of understanding and recognition. Nuclear weapons play a great deal in terms of images, perceptions, psychology. I do not believe that nuclear weapons play any real military role in Israeli military thinking. Psychologically, I think that Shibli is right that Israel would like to have the ultimate card, but it's much more in the sense of having an insurance policy to tell Israelis, to tell the world, Holocaust would never happen again, but I don't think that Holocaust we are facing anytime soon. So I think that the whole notion that Israel could, under some circumstances, use nuclear weapons is nil, doesn't exist. But I think that if war is going to take, in a moment I'll respond to your question, but I think it's an important issue what I want to say. But I think that if war is going to drag on for a while, Israel does have various kind of cards which the world may not know, and it can inflict so-called conventionally a great deal of damage. I also believe that Israel in the last, and this is somewhat speculation, somewhat a very vague knowledge. I believe that Israel in the last few years has created a great deal of new capability in terms of cyber warfare. It has never been used. There is uncertainty about it, but I think there is a sense that we Israel, have strategic assets that can give us strategic advantage right now. If we're going not to use it, it may be gone. And I think that this surprise may play a major role in the thinking of Netanyahu and Barak to go to war in the next 12 months or 18 months, because Israel may have something deep, strategically important in its tool bag that they believe that time has come to use it. Otherwise, it will be gone. About your question, Israel will make a decision by a forum of 14 ministers, the defense and security cabinet. There is inner cabinet of eight ministers. The view would ultimately have to be approved, I understand, by the rest of the cabinet. Apparently, according to some Israeli papers, at the present time, Benjamin Netanyahu may have a very slight majority within the inner cabinet of 8 ministers. But it will be that forum that will have to make a decision. Almost everybody believes that forum has not made a decision, but many people believe that a great deal of the fighting that took place in the last 2 years between the previous chief of staff, Gabi Ashkenazi, and Ehud Barak, had to do with Iran, had to do with guidance to do certain things about Iran, short of war. And Ashkenazi, who was not happy about it, apparently he provided reports that the army is not ready to do certain things. And in the eyes of Barak and Netanyahu, especially Barak, it was almost like a resistance of a military officer, the chief military officer, to take the guidance of the elected political officially in the country. So,
on Iran, there's certainly not 40 people in the room making the decision. 14, yeah. In Iran, there's, I would argue that the nuclear ship is steered by the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. I can't tell you how many people are in the room, but if I had to guess, I would say it's less than a dozen. By the way, I would say that President Ahmadinejad is probably not in that room. What's interesting about Khamenei when you try to get inside his head, if you look at his track record of the last 23 years in which he's been supreme leader, he's been someone who sought to preserve the status quo by avoiding transformative decisions. And what's happening now is that Iran is faced with an unprecedented level of international economic and political pressure. And Khamenei's back is increasingly up against the wall. And I see two exit doors for him, both of which would be transformative for Iran. And the first exit door is to go for some type of a deal, a nuclear compromise. And he's averse to compromise for a whole variety of reasons. One, he believes that if you compromise when you're being pressured, that's not going to alleviate the pressure. It's going to project weakness and invite even more pressure. Two, he looks at contemporary history. And he looks at the case of Gaddafi and Libya. And what he took away from Gaddafi's experience was that when Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program in 2006, he made himself vulnerable to the NATO intervention in 2011. He looks at the situation in Pakistan. And he believes that when Pakistan actually crossed the nuclear threshold and detonated a weapon, paradoxically, it alleviated the pressure against Pakistan, and outside threats and pressure turned into outside engagement and inducements. So I think that for a variety of reasons, Khamenei is averse to compromise, but at the same time, again, what's paramount for him is to keep the system in place, to keep the system in power. And I think that if he calculates that it's either he has to do a deal or keep going and risk the health of the system, I think that he may ultimately compromise. So it's been widely asserted that what we're doing, what the US is doing with this policy of pressure, is increasing the likelihood that Iran will actually go for a nuclear weapon. I think that's true, but I think that's only half the equation. I think we're basically increasing the likelihood that Khamenei has to take a decision. Because in the past, what he wanted to pursue, I would argue, and Avner alluded to it, was the Japan model. And that's to have a nuclear weapons capability, but remain a screwdriver turn away. And that's unacceptable to Israel. So I see that he has either the Pakistan model ahead of him, which is actually to go for a bomb, believing that if he acquires a bomb, that will provide them a cloak of immunity. But the risk in that is that if he goes for a bomb, he has to calculate that the regime can withstand current levels of pressure for the duration of the time it will take them to acquire a nuke, which is not months. We're talking about probably years. And so I see him in a very difficult position. And both of these paths, both the path of a nuclear compromise or the path of a nuclear weapon, are wrought with a lot of landmines for him.
Each of you sort of highlighted in a way the inertial qualities of what's going on. So there's a question here: how does one diminish the danger of war, given what Shibli pointed out was a way of thinking in Israeli strategic thinking, and the sort of failure of the Obama administration to achieve change with regard to the regime for the reasons that you stated. Shibli, yeah.
Well, there are a couple of things. I mean, at some strategic level, it's really hard to see a deal that's going to be acceptable to Israel.
Yeah.
I mean, it is just when you look at it. I mean, if you look at the Obama AIPAC speech, where he spoke, strongly in favor of Israel and against the Iran nuclear program, he spoke against Iran acquiring a bomb, not about Iran acquiring capabilities. The Israelis' position privately has been they don't want to see Iran enriching on Iranian soil. And there is no one I know in Iran, among Iran analysts or those of us who follow this any closely, who believes that you can ever get an Iranian leadership, certainly not in this regime, that will agree to that. So it is very hard for me to find. I can see a deal that would be acceptable to the Obama administration. I can see that. I think that's within the realm of the possible. I cannot see a deal that is acceptable to Israel, at least in the way Israel is projecting itself, not just publicly, but privately with the administration about what is required. So starting with that, that's a source of pessimism. Public opinion does matter. I mean, go back to what I projected. It matters because any political leader is in the end going to go into a blind situation with risks. I mean, the Israelis are uncertain. They may have more information than we do and more capabilities that we know about, but there is a lot of uncertainty, and they don't know how this is going to play itself out, and there will be consequences. If they go with all these risks, and the public opinion in Israel doesn't want them to go without American support, the administration doesn't want them to go with American support, they lose the international coalition on sanctions almost immediately once they strike, because the consensus based on a diplomatic solution, there will be consequences politically for them, unless it was a magical solution, the likes of which no one expects. So I think the public opinion issue matters a lot, and you can see that both Obama and Netanyahu were playing the public opinion game, both in America and in Israel. Netanyahu is trying to play the American public opinion against Netanyahu. Obama is doing this. And I would say through the visit of Netanyahu to Washington, Obama won that round of public opinion in both places. That's not guaranteed he's going to win them again, but it might have bought him a day or two. I don't know how long.
Yeah, I agree a great deal with what Shibli just has said. I would add one or two more caveats. One is in the spirit of this op-ed that was published a number of weeks ago in New York Times by former Ambassador Pickering. If you'll be able to put into a deal some smart, creative language that would neutralize most or all of what Iran has said in terms of its specific hostility to Israel. There are disagreements, there are political issues involved, but if that hostility towards the very illegitimacy of Israel will be gone, I think in terms of the world, but also in terms of Israel itself, it would make it much more difficult for Israel to go to war just on what would be seen by many as nuance about the details of the enrichment program. I think that most professional Israelis realize that there is no way to go back to the notion of no enrichment at all in Iran. So what you would like to have is a deal with a great deal of technical issue that will give Israel and the world a sense of timely warning if Iran is going to have what we call breakout towards the bomb, in terms of additional protocol and perhaps of other technical measures, but also to neutralize, to find a smart language, the basic hostility that would keep Iran with disagreement on the Palestinian issue, on other issue, but the basic hostility to Israel will be put aside. I think here maybe, and I'm still pessimistic, I'm still close to what Shibli has said. I think it's very, very difficult to find a deal. But I think also I agree with Shibli that the fact that much of the public opinion in Israel today is against war in a variety of ways. By the way, people who follow Facebook, in the last few days there is this popular thing of Israelis to Iranians saying, we do not want war with you, we are friends of you, we'd like to celebrate you for the new year. This was just completely spontaneous. It's anecdotal, but it's interesting. So, there is a reason to have a great deal of pessimism, but at the same time, there are some glimmering of hopes here and there.
Just very quickly, Shibli, you mentioned in your talk that 3-4 months ago, you saw that there was a paradigm shift and the concerns about an Israeli strike on Iran went up significantly. You said you weren't sure why that was. And the reason why that was that Iran commenced this nuclear facility, which is basically built inside a bunker. It's built inside of a mountain outside of the city of Qom. And this goes to your question, Harry, is that I remember at the time when Iran commenced this, I happened to run into a friend of mine at the White House. And he asked me, he said, do you think that Iran is trying to purposely provoke some type of a military conflagration for its own domestic political expediency? And he said because it was articulated to them indirectly that this would be transgressing an Israeli red line. And I think that's something which the White House is very mindful of, the fact that you do have these hardline elements within the Iranian system who wouldn't mind some type of a military strike on the nuclear facilities, because it could be one of the few things that could resuscitate this dying revolutionary ideology and repair the dramatic gulf and dramatic internal fractures between rulers and ruled in Iran. So I think that that's something that the White House is very mindful of. I'm not sure it's something that the Israeli leadership really cares all that much about.
There's something that comes up again in the questions, but you hear it all the time on the news. What is the danger if Iran acquired a nuclear weapon, that it would give it to a terrorist group such as, a group such as Hezbollah or Hamas? Is that a real possibility?
Well, I can give you my own opinion, and obviously there are opinions on this. I think it's one of the most improbable things that you can do. No state, even particularly with groups that are outside of its own control, even if they're, if their clients, wants to give such a weapon that they cannot control. I mean, forget about tracing a bomb, but it is something. I mean, you can even argue that within Iran itself, one of the reasons why they may worry about having a bomb is deciding who, even internally, is going to control it, which constituency is going to have control over it. I can't imagine it. I think the worry usually about the transfer of technology is more when, in fact, there's a state collapse, and just as we saw in the former Soviet Union, or we worry about what might happen in Pakistan. Those are certainly far more serious scenarios. Personally, I just don't see it. I don't think that's one of the fears that have to be placed high in the priorities.
I agree.
Well, if we're allowed to ask one another question,
yeah, please.
The question which I posed to Avner on our way walking over here, and he didn't want to preempt himself, so now this is for the whole audience. But I was recounting for him a conversation I had with the previous Israeli ambassador to the U.S., and I posed this question to him, which is, what is it that worries Israel most about an Iranian nuclear weapon? And he didn't say that we're worried that Iran would lob missiles into Israel, or even that Iran would lend nuclear missiles to nuclear weapons to Hezbollah or Islamic Jihad or Hamas. What he did say, this was his top concern, is that if Iran were to acquire a nuclear weapon, it would basically create a black cloud hovering over the state of Israel, which would make it much more difficult to recruit diaspora Jews to come and live in Israel, and it would also hasten emigration away from Israel. My question to Avner was, wouldn't a war do more of that than Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon? But I would be curious to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, with all due respect to that former ambassador, I think it's nonsense, totally nonsense. I think for a country that was deeply concerned, almost from the day it was born, to create a national insurance policy in the form of nuclear weapons program, with a certain message to the world. This is only to have insurance national policy for never again. That's its role, that's its project. To think, and by now that country has all kind of speculation from 100 to 200, whatever numbers there are, to think that that country, its future suddenly will be gone because Iran is reaching nuclear weapons capability and people would run away and people would not come. I think it's undermining and an insult to Israel itself to the extent that I think it's even shameful response. But I do believe, as I said here, that the Israeli major concern is somewhat abstract and somewhat strategic. Losing, I somewhat, talking biblical terms, I somewhat compare it to Samson in the Bible losing his magic, losing his hair. The notion of Israel losing that unique, benign monopoly, that not that Israel used it to dictate, but in the sense of that unique situation that Israel has that sense of comfort, and certain kind of images and perceptions are being spread around. Because if the Middle East start to move to a situation of, not even there, but a situation towards some sort of parity, that Israel has many and others have a few, even if it takes a long time for a country to have a full nuclear weapons posture. Even that the Israeli interest is shifted that nobody will have nuclear weapons. So Israel would love to have monopoly, a benign monopoly, a monopoly with the least incentive for others to go nuclear. But if you lose that, because Israel is so superior today conventionally, it's really, and because of its basic asymmetries, geographical and so forth asymmetries, its interest is that nobody would have nuclear weapons, including Israel itself. That's its true strategic interest. So I think that the reason is strategic. Israel would like to keep its monopoly, and some people believe, including some people in power, that a war which they believe they can win, worth it.
But, I just want to just nuance this a little bit, because while I think the nuclear issue itself may not be, a source of fear for Israelis living in Israel, given how strong Israel is in its capacity to retaliate, the rhetoric about the threat is
I agree.
And we see that, as I said, in public opinion, that when you postulate it as an existential threat if Iran acquires nuclear weapons, if you compare it to the Holocaust,
right,
if Iran acquires nuclear weapons, there is evidence, as I said in the polls, that it's having an impact on the Israeli public perception of the threat. So the rhetoric about it is definitely having an impact.
Yeah.
I wanted to, does anybody have a question of one of your fellow panelists? Because this would be an opportunity to do that.
Well, there is a great deal of agreement actually between us. I don't think it's that surprising, but there is a great deal of agreement between us.
Then let me ask one other question which appears in the cards, and that is Iran a rational actor? Because again and again, I think we perceive Iran as a place that, because of the religious beliefs, because of the Ayatollah's dominance in the decision-making process, the role of the Revolutionary Guard in controlling the terrorist networks, and so on. So what is your assessment? In other words, were Iran to get a weapon, would they act rationally along the lines of deterrence?
Yeah, I mean, my argument is kind of what I said earlier, that Iran is a rational actor and that what's paramount for this regime is to remain in power. And so, regimes which are irrational don't usually reach their 33rd birthday. The Iranian regime had its 33rd birthday not long ago. But there's two sides of that rational actor coin. And so on one hand, what's paramount for them is to stay in power. On the other hand, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, that these autocrats are quite shrewd. I think we oftentimes underestimate the shrewdness of autocrats like Ayatollah Khamenei, like Bashar al-Assad, like the late Kim Jong-il. And I think they're shrewd in knowing that they can be dictators of closed domains. But when you open up those systems to the forces of globalization, they're smart enough to recognize they can be swept aside with the tide. And for that reason, I think Iran poses a difficult challenge to the United States because, again, you have a country ruled by what I would describe as a cartel, which doesn't act in national interests, it acts in cartel interests. And if I was the personal advisor to the Iranian supreme leader, and my goal was to keep him in power and keep the regime in place, I wouldn't tell him to act differently. Meaning, I think that if he were to open up to the United States and abandon this hostile rhetoric towards Israel, I think that he is smart to think that it would go the direction of the Soviet Union, that the system would basically be swept aside with the current of history. So them being a rational actor, again, is a double-edged sword, because on one hand, they want to stay in power. I believe if they had a nuclear weapon, that wouldn't change. The concern is that they would miscalculate, and they would feel this cloak of immunity, so they could double down on groups like Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad. That's certainly a concern. But again, I think it just makes it that much more difficult to reach some type of a modus vivendi with this regime.
Well, sometimes the use of the term rationality is misleading, because it's obviously, you have to ask what is their objectives, and it's the disagreement that seems to be disagreement in the assessment is mostly about what their objectives are. When in one of the Berkeley grads who worked with Ken Waltz in the good old days was Shai Feldman, who wrote his dissertation, which turned out into a book about deterrence in the Middle East. And actually, in some ways, while working with Ken developed this thing about the more the merrier in terms of nuclear proliferation. But you don't have to accept that thesis to accept the notion that Shai himself developed about, quote, cost sensitivity. It's not about rationality in terms of matching the same logic of calculation. Are you cost sensitive? If you look at the Iranian regime, I mean, you look at Khomeini himself from the day he got into office and during the behavior throughout the Iraq-Iran war, he had said, committed completely, he will never give up until Saddam Hussein was removed and the Baathists were over, and he would accept whatever cost. And in the end, he swallowed hard, and he said, like I'm drinking a cup of poison, and died within weeks, actually, of that. Accepted what was to him humiliating, in large part because the costs were too high, and he was seen to have been defeated. Although, whatever the victory is, Saddam Hussein won. To me, there's nothing that I see. I mean, not like their objectives, but there's nothing that I look at in the Iranian behavior that tells me that they're not cost sensitive. There's nothing. Throughout the whole history of the revolution, really since the overthrow of the Shah, I see them as very calculating and very cost sensitive, whatever their objectives are.
Yeah, I would like to give a little more philosophical commentary about this notion of rationality. In some trivial sense, we are all rational. We human beings, as well as almost all of us, even those paranoids and schizophrenics and so forth, as well as nations. In some trivial sense, in the sense of being some logical connection between means and consequences, we are all rationals. But if to give it a Humean flavor from David Hume, who used to say that the reason is only the slave of the passions or the emotions, could be always a situation that nations as well as people find themselves in a very situation of irrationality that they have to respond and to do something. And the result is what we call from the outside irrational. So sometimes you can find yourself in a situation of pressure, in situations of conflicting informations, that you do something that you don't really want to do, but you find yourself to have to do. I think even in the questions of striking against Iran, I thought it was very prudent on the side of Ariel Sharon and Netanyahu. By the way, not many people know that Ariel Sharon in 2004 decided against strike. At that time it was very quiet, of the Natanz. When Israel discovered for the first time Natanz, it was not yet in the press. There were those people who raised the possibility of Israel just following what she did in Iraq and would attack Natanz. And Ariel Sharon ruled it out. And then his entire policy was to say as little as possible, not to put myself in a bind to do something. I think there is a great deal of danger by the language that both Barak and Netanyahu in the last few months that gave themselves, and making almost that there is a certain commitment, they make the commitment to be public, and in doing so, if no arrangement, if no deal that would satisfy Israel or satisfy them, Barak and Netanyahu, will be reached, they almost compel themselves to take an action. I think when leader puts himself in that kind of situation, it's very, very dangerous. So even leaders who are rational, who wants to be rational, sometimes they can find themselves in a situation that they act irrationally. And there is a danger.
One final question, which is, this public opinion is on the table, and we see that there's really a lack of interest in war and a concern about war. And then some of the ideas that are in leaders' heads about what they're acting, it seems to all be out of sync. So the question is, how can the public make a difference in sort of bringing out some of these the ideas that are motivating the leaders and actually prevent the rush to war?
As I said, I am, although I study public opinion, I understand how decisions are made, and certainly governments sometimes go against public opinions and prevail. And what they bet, of course, is that particularly when it comes to war decision, that the morning after there will be a rallying around the flag, and it's going to happen inevitably, no matter what the situation was. And so every government would expect that they're going to have public support the morning after, including the Israeli government. You could have 90% of the Israeli public opposing it. They make a decision tomorrow, and immediately they'll be all united until after the war, and then they'll figure out who's responsible. Where it really makes a difference is where the assessment about the consequences are uncertain. And every leader is going to have to consider, what the accounting is going to be the morning after the war ends, or if it ends. And I think we are in an arena of certainty. So it pushes leaders to be far more certain about the consequences and far more prepared if they in fact engage, and to do their homework more, even if it doesn't change their mind, because they all have to pay a price. And I think that is certainly true with any Israeli government, not only pertaining to its own public opinion, but with American public opinion. Because I think in the end, the morning after, American public opinion, when Israel is at war with Iran, will support Israel. There'll be no question about that. But if the war goes on for 3 months, and the oil prices go through the roofs, and people are lined up, and it looks like not a winnable war, and people start asking, why are we in this mess? There are going to be huge consequences. No Israeli leader can do their thinking about what might happen without that. And trust me, Iran is not Israel's top priority. America is. America is always Israel's top priority. And we have to understand that whatever any Israeli leader, when they think, the only reason why Israel might do it without American official support is they know that America would be behind them. So it matters. It matters here. It matters in Israel.
Yeah. Just to add a few more ideas to that, I think that's the real what Shibli ends. It's maybe the real question of bluffing about Netanyahu. Whether for him Iran is truly the most important thing, that he wants to act and to move Israel to act as a sovereign actor, or whether indeed he realized that the most important issue is America and he cannot reform. And on that, I'm not so sure, because he may be bluffing, but he may be not bluffing. I also want to emphasize that because of those uncertainties, the likelihood for the United States to be engaged and to be involved early on is precisely to prevent a situation that kind of catastrophe or calamity may continue for a long time. I think only by inflicting promptly and strongly enormous damage and pain on Iran can be convinced to end it quickly. Otherwise, it could drag on weeks and possibly months. And to do it and to prevent that, Israel would have to. And it's not clear that maybe Israel has this fantastic surprise for the beginning. But once there is a war, and once it's continued for a few days, and maybe Iran would not be blind as it was at the first stage of that kind of war, you need some dramatic means to bring ceasefire, and it's not clear that Israel has them. So the amount of gamble, the amount of uncertainty is enormously different and much more than, for example, Menachem Begin had in 81. Even though in 81 there was some gambling when he decided to do what he did. And I think the fact that the public is showing himself much more forcefully against such thing is something to be reckoned with. So there is some check and balances that in the past we did not have in the Israeli political landscape.
Well, I want to thank our panel for a really informative session. Thank you.